Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas B. Miras. In today's episode, I'm talking to journalist Peter Jesserer Smith about the importance of the Native American Catholic legacy to the new evangelization. Today's Tuesday. It's 14 hours later than I normally release the episode on Tuesday, but this particular episode was plagued at every stage of the episode birthing process with technical and human difficulties. So I apologize to those who did not get it as expected this morning. That said, I never actually promised that I would get it out Tuesday mornings. I just promised that I would get it out every Tuesday, so I feel satisfied. I hope you will be too. Speaking of technical difficulties, I have to apologize for one glaring issue in the interview this episode. Basically, shortly after the conversation started, I had some serious technical issues on my end, which resulted in my having to switch to my phone, which means that my audio quality takes a huge drop. So, to be honest, the audio quality on my end of the conversation is pretty cruddy a lot of the time, and I have to apologize for that. However, thankfully, my guest does most of the talking by far, so it's not ultimately that big of a deal, and I'm working on getting the various problems that led to having to switch to my phone resolved for the next one. So thank you for your patience. It's only my third one. I know I keep saying this. My guest today is Peter Jesserer Smith. He is a journalist. He writes for the National Catholic Register, among other places. I know Peter from the one single solitary year I spent at Christendom College. I think he was a senior. I was a freshman. And I was the arts and culture editor for the Christendom College student newspaper, and he was the editor-in-chief. And I'm not sure how I got away with writing some of the things that I did, because I would always choose like the most obscure, weird, esoteric stuff to cover. I remember once I wrote this article about this band called Secret Chiefs 3, which combines like vaguely Iraqi sounding music with grindcore and electronic elements. And the guy who runs the band claims that it's all strictly based on Pythagorean mathematical theory. To be honest, I was trolling a little bit. Like, I genuinely did like that band, but I knew it was like ridiculous to write this and expect, people at Christendom to be interested in it. And of course, that was the response I got. Except, one day, the guy who came to fix my dorm room door, the maintenance guy, mentioned that article, and he was like, oh yeah, that was really interesting. And I was like, you know what? If the maintenance dude can enjoy my article about the Secret Chiefs 3, then, these supposedly liberally educated Christendom guys can. Not to assume that the maintenance guy wasn't educated. I'm sure he was. But you know what I'm saying. Anyway, thankfully, Peter didn't exercise too heavy a editorial hand. So today we're talking about, or he is talking about, because I don't know anything about this, the Native American Catholic legacy, and particularly the legacy of really outstanding missionary work and what we call inculturation done by mostly French Jesuit missionaries, not exclusively. We're primarily going to be talking about the missions in the Northeast and the Southeast, so the Great Lakes area in northern New York and Canada, and then the La Florida mission. In the La Florida missions, there were over 1,000 martyrdoms that nobody knows about. Peter makes a very good argument, in my opinion, as to why the Native American Catholic heritage is important to know about and something that we can really learn from in the new evangelization. A lot of it really seems to embody the spiritual paradigm laid out for lay holiness in the Second Vatican Council. You can find links to plenty of Peter's articles, timestamps, and other links for this episode at catholicculture.org/episode 3. All right, here goes. Enjoy. Enjoy! Hi, Peter. Thanks for coming on to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thank you so much, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you were the editor of the student newspaper at Christendom College, where I was the arts and culture editor as a freshman. So it's funny that we're doing this all these years later and that you're a journalist. That's very cool. And I wouldn't call myself a journalist, but I'm working in media at least. So it's neat.
No, it is really interesting. I've got to a number of people who worked on that newspaper eventually entered journalism, and here I am at EWTN's National Catholic Register as a staff writer. So
great.
That's where our paths took us.
Yep.
Why is Native American Catholic history and culture important for the new evangelization?
Tom, I really think, and this has been one of the great things I've been able to do through my work with the Register, but I really think that what we have with Native American Catholics and the history of their societies and their cultures is really the taproot, the spiritual taproot of American Catholic faith. And I really think that if we want to become the evangelized people, the intentional disciples of Jesus Christ, if we want to become the missionary disciples that Pope Francis talks about in Evangelii Gaudium, if we want to be a truly evangelized people that are spreading the gospel, we need to go back to our roots, and we need to go back and we need to relearn and re-understand the stories of our forefathers and foremothers in the faith, which are the Catholics, those Catholics who embraced this gospel of Jesus Christ from their own nations and their own tribes and became on fire with it. The beautiful thing, Tom, is that for the most part, these are laymen and laywomen who are giving a heroic witness to the faith, even to the point of martyrdom. There's a mass martyrdom of these Catholics here on U.S. soil that hardly anybody knows about it, but it impressed deeply the King of Spain. And today the cause is called the Martyrs of La Florida. I really encourage your listeners to go check it out and to learn these stories, because I really feel that I can identify with these people, especially being a layman. Several hundred years ago, these people were living the kind of call to holiness that the Second Vatican Council years later would ask the Church to follow, that St. John Paul II would really call people to, and the popes, before and after him. There's a very powerful, there's wonderful stories here and examples of saintliness that I think is a treasury we really need in our modern day.
So in his homily that he gave, St. John Paul II, this was in Huronia at the Martyrs' Shrine in 1984. He says, "We must also recall how the worthy traditions of the Indian tribes were strengthened and enriched by the gospel message. These new Christians knew by instinct that the gospel, far from destroying their authentic values and customs, had the power to purify and uplift the cultural heritage which they had received. During her long history, the Church herself has been constantly enriched by the new traditions which are added to her life and legacy." And he also says that the revival of Indian culture will be a revival of those same Christian values which they inherited, and that the world needs to see these values so that the whole world via the Church can be enriched by them.
Yes.
So what is it that the missionaries were impressed with in the Native American cultures?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think that's a good place for us to really start to renew our understanding of the story, because one of the things that they came across was, particularly in the part of North America where I live, the Great Lakes region, these are family-based societies. They are societies that the extended family is very important. The relationships that you have with your cousins and your aunts and your uncles, the various members of the clans that you live with, who are part of your nation, there's a very keen sense of relationship. They also tended to have family groups that would live together. Now, I'll give you an example in the Longhouse. That's a particular feature of society around where I live, in which you just don't have this nuclear family concept of mom, dad, and kids, but you have different generations living together and supporting each other. If somebody gets sick, the entire family comes together to help them. And the idea of the village is really as a family of families. These are very important concepts. And so when actually the native person, such as Awendat, which is the nation that St. John de Brebeuf ministered to for 15 years until his martyrdom. They're also known as the Huron, so I'll stick with Huron because it's going to be more familiar with people. But he sees this. He sees this. It's a very beautiful culture in which people support each other. So when they're looking at this revelation that God has become, that the Creator, whom they love deeply, has become a man, in order to be more intimate with them. And they also realize, there's this beautiful family connection that I can relate to, that the Creator has become man so that he might be one of us and that we might also be part of him, be part of his family. So the beautiful thing about many Native peoples here is that, at least for most of where we would say the United States and present-day Canada, is that they already have very much a deep devotion to the Creator. Sometimes he's called the Great Spirit or the Grandfather Spirit. Those are just, in certain ways, I think are, English may clumsily translate that, but again, there's that family relationship. And so the beautiful thing is that when the missionary when Brebeuf comes and is trying to speak through their language and their culture, the thing that he's trying to get across is that, and which one person really understands, is very important in our story, is that the Creator, whom they already love and know through nature and his care for them through nature, became a man in a particular time and a place that is not even part of the Jesuits' culture. Jesuit is French, but the Creator comes to this little place, Bethlehem of Judea, and that's where the revelation is, that he has become man and he loves all of us intimately and deeply, and he wants all of us to know him and to become like him and his love. That's a very, very beautiful and powerful thing. And it was a very pious member of the Bear Clan, Chiwatenhwa, at least that's how I understand best to pronounce his name. He hears this message during, I believe it was the Feast of Souls. It was an important feast. Brebeuf speaks, and he has a very powerful experience of the Holy Spirit. And this is told in a biography written by Bruce Henry called Friends of God, in which he tells the story of Chiwatenhwa. Chiwatenhwa is always listening for the voice of the Creator, wants to grow closer to the Creator, and now this has been fulfilled in a very powerful way, that the Creator has become man, and this changes Chiwatenhwa's life. If we all had that kind of, and Chiwatenhwa's story is incredible, but my point is that his life becomes absolutely transformed, not because it's a major break with his culture. And what's attractive is actually that it's really truly a fulfillment of many things that he sees in his culture. And there are other little extra things that he sees strengthen their culture, such as the sacrament of matrimony. So the bond between Chiwatenhwa and his wife, Marie Aonetta, she later takes the name Marie. He takes the name Joseph, and then she later is baptized and takes the name Marie. And they become like the missionary disciple power couple that Pope Francis could only dream of, and which I think John Paul II understood that the church in North America had enormous, powerful saints for our times right here. And he says they have a heroic witness of faith. It was almost like he was asking the bishops of Canada, please bring these people, advance this cause, bring these people before the entire church so that we can see in a very powerful way what what lay people who really experience Jesus Christ and become overwhelmed with his love, what they do in evangelizing others and spreading the faith. I think that's what he was asking.
So Chiwatenhwa, did you say he was a Huron?
Yes. So he was he was a Huron, and just for the audience's benefit, that's a French name given to them. They call themselves Wendat.
Right.
The
Wendat.
But yes, so he was Huron, and the neat thing that happened here was, a lot of us think that spreading the gospel is done by priests and missionaries. They go into a place and they start talking about Jesus or whatever, and then all of a sudden, thousands of people converted. And I think that's told in a lot of maybe some hagiographies from you're trying to look back on what 1,000 years of European experience was like. But Native American cultures are actually, the way that they're set up is a lot more similar to our own in America today than it actually was to European societies. I mean, for example, a lot of the European missionaries had this idea that, well, you got to go convert the leader, because that's what our ancestors did, right? The missionary goes up and says, well, all these people are listening to the king, so if I convert the king, I get all these people to come to Christ. Well, Huron society and Iroquois society and all these native societies are fairly democratic. They're built on consensus. They're not all democratic to the same degree, but they have chiefs and clan mothers, and there's a political division of responsibility between men and women, but there's no king, really. I mean, people will be influenced by certain important leaders, just as they are today in our own society, but there's no king to say, okay, well, now that I'm Catholic, all my subjects will now become Catholic. This is important because now the faith actually has to be spread by persuasion, by actually demonstrating it to people, by actually showing people and inviting them into this relationship. And that's, I think, where knowing our own story here and knowing the story of Chiwatenhwa and Joseph Chiwatenhwa and his wife Marie Aonetta is vital to how we're going to evangelize our own society today.
So can you tell us a little bit more about them? They were, Chiwatenhwa was evangelized by St. John de Brebeuf, correct?
Yes. So Chiwatenhwa hears John de Brebeuf speak, and he becomes impressed. He really believes that the Creator is giving a revelation through the black robes to them and to his nation, his people, and he becomes overwhelmed with wanting to see his nation and his people all brought into the fullness of this revelation. And so it's funny because he kind of keeps, from what we know through the Jesuit relations, he kind of keeps pressing them, to make him a Christian. And the Jesuits, this is all very new to them, really. And so they're a little bit more hesitant to do so. He gets very sick, nearly dies, and basically upbraids them and says, I could have died. You should baptize me. And so they say, well, okay, well, all right. But the neat thing is that his wife, Aonetta, converts about 6 months later. And she takes, if I recall correctly, the name Marie. So he takes the name Joseph. So the father of the Holy Family, Jesus' foster father. And she takes the name Marie. So very much for Mary. So the model immediately that this couple takes is the Holy Family, which is also the patron of your show.
Right.
And they together are evangelizing. And the important thing here is that we know a lot of what Chiwatenhwa said and did because for cultural reasons, it's easy for the Jesuits at the time, to say and tell what is going on with men because they're men. A little more difficult for them to interact directly with women. But this is a society in which women have a lot of authority and responsibility. particularly when it comes to selecting chiefs who will make certain decisions, and particularly over matters such as whether to go to war or whether to conclude peace. And this even goes to the arrangement of the household. So it was the woman's family that if the man married her, he left his family and cleaved to his wife. He lived with her and her extended family, and each longhouse was owned by the oldest, most senior woman, generally. So that particular clan mother. Joseph, in order to be successful in his mission, really truly needed the full cooperation of his wife Marie, and he definitely had it. So from the little that we know, she was a co-evangelist with him and very much dedicated to raising up a family of saints. It's one of the most eloquent things that we have from her is she approaches some relatives after Chiwatenhwa's death, 3 years after his conversion, and they're weeping at his still weeping at his grave 2.5 years later. And she approaches them and she says, "Stop this. Let us together raise up a family of saints so that we may all be together with him." I'm trying to recall that from memory, but that's a beautiful example of what holiness is. And they were a normal married couple. This wasn't like one of those married couples we had, King Henry and Empress Adele or whatever, saying, "Well, now that we're married, let's all live as celibates." It's a little harder for people in the modern day to identify with, but Joseph and Marie had a normal marriage,
right?
And they loved their children like normal married people do, and they wanted them to become saints and to become holy, and they spread the gospel as a family, and I think they got their wish.
I understand there's some possibility that Chiwatenhwa was martyred.
Yes, and that's a very interesting thing. And it's a little difficult and I do truly believe that it was a martyrdom, but who did it and why is going to be unknown to history. And it's probably because Chiwatenhwa wanted that way. Chiwatenhwa's and Aonetta's evangelization received a lot of pushback. At a certain point, the resistance was becoming more intense. And the reason is largely due to the unfortunate impact of disease. The Europeans brought diseases with them, some of which were communicable through humans, but probably the most devastating diseases were likely contributed by other vectors such as rats. And rats, as we know, wiped out European populations a few centuries earlier on massive scales,
right?
Sometimes 60, sometimes 80, 90%. I mean, whole entire villages wiped out. The Europeans had already had that kind of experience. And we think that something similar had happened to native populations in the Americas. And which is part of the problem, is because one of the things that we have to take into account is that when the Jesuits when a lot of the first contact is being made, we only get glimpses of what pre-contact might have been like, because when you have diseases that have already wiped out possibly 80, 90% of the populations that were once there, you have a society that is in turmoil and destabilized.
Right.
So, for example, when Jacques Cartier first came down the St. Lawrence and he was writing back to France, he says, "There's no way you can possibly send a colony here because there's no room. There are native peoples everywhere. They're on the beach. They're everywhere." Well, when Samuel de Champlain, decades later, arrives, he says, "I don't know what Cartier was talking about. There's nobody here." And that's likely because certain diseases, possibly rats that got thrown over with the garbage or through shipwreck or whatever, transmitted disease.
This spread of disease was prior even to real thoroughgoing contact between the Europeans and the natives.
Yeah, so that's part of the speculation is that before sustained contact, there was already some way that disease hit these populations. There's a study that was published in 2010, for example, that concluded, based on the historical evidence, that the reason that the English were able to colonize Massachusetts Plymouth Bay was because, likely due to a particular disease spread by rats called leptospirosis, with something called Weil syndrome. And it's basically medical detective work. But you have the introduction of a disease that is extremely lethal if you're a highly hygienic person, which may blow your mind. But with the Native American, what you had observed was somebody who basically bathed every day, which Europeans used to do, but didn't at this particular time. But the Native American person would bathe every day, or if the conditions were not amenable, would also use the sweat lodge, which was also another way of hygienically cleansing the body from various, impurities, bad things that accumulate, stuff that you may pay hundreds of dollars now for some health guru. But they had that, and they had sophisticated, balanced diets. But the problem with these diseases is that they thrive on close contact. And you have societies where people are using water. Well, this particular disease, leptospirosis, spreads through water contact. And these rats, if they fouled up the ground, well, you have people who don't have any footwear because you don't need it. So why would, Europeans developed it and needed it more, but Native peoples didn't. So the ground also becomes a source of contact for this particular disease.
Right.
And then if you get it, well, your entire family is taking care of you. So they're all going to get it. So you have very healthy people who are most vulnerable to various particular diseases. And we also know this because when people from, the United States have to travel to third world countries, they've got to be very careful about their health, about what they use to bathe, what they eat, and things like that, because they're actually the most vulnerable person there. So I use that as a particular analogy, that you've got this contact happening, and nobody knows about the germ theory of disease, but the Huron are not stupid. They recognize that when the Europeans come, diseases follow with them, and they're very suspicious. Why is it that when you pour water on my wife's head after, when she has baptism, that she's dead 3 days later? And that's been a mystery that some medical professionals have been trying to figure out since then. And that's one of the hypotheses, is that somehow possibly water was contaminated by who knows what. Maybe it was rats, or maybe it was something else. And so in other words, the Jesuits are trying to spread the gospel, and don't want, they have no idea that the water is bad. The whole, all this idea of precautions and things like that are medical developments that take place 100 and more years later. So they don't understand what's going on. They want to spread the gospel, and yet there's these diseases that are ravaging these people, that they not only want to spread the gospel, but they also want to be allies of the French, at least in this part of North America. So that we're talking about. So anyway, there's various things going on. So Chiwatenhwa is basically struggling with saying, look, the gospel is something is beautiful. It is completely in line with the tradition of our ancestors, and this will make us. This will bring us closer to our Creator, and be of overall benefit to us. So clearly, some people think that is absolutely wrong. There's concerns. Both Chiwatenhwa and Aonetta have concerns about the safety of themselves and their family, but Chiwatenhwa has a series of mysterious dreams, and in native cultures, the dreams have very much a high level of significance, as they did for the Jews, as we read in the Hebrews, as we read in the Bible about God speaking in dreams. And one of the dreams that Chiwatenhwa has is he sees very vividly his own death. He sees himself out in the field, in the bush, and about 3 or 4 Iroquois come upon him, and he fights with them, and they attack him to the ground, they scalp him, and they split his head open. And this happens over and over again. And people realize this is something is going on here. And the temptation is, if these are evil spirits that have designs on you, then what you should do is you should, I think as Bruce Henry says in his biography, the thing to do would have been to make a sacrifice of dogs, or in order to appease the bad spirits and hopefully avert the particular evil. But for Chiwatenhwa to do that would effectively mean renouncing the faith, and he won't do that. So people are telling him, just make the sacrifice, okay? And he refuses, and he deliberately says, no, the Creator is more powerful than any sort of evil spirits, and so I will trust my entire life to the Creator and accept whatever is coming my way. And eventually it does come to pass. Now, the Jesuits immediately thought that it must have been some Seneca, which is one of the 5 Iroquois nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, that were coming through. But they later started to wonder whether possibly it was some Huron who just wanted Chiwatenhwa out of the way. They were done with this Christianity business. And who knows, maybe it was a murder for hire. We don't know, and it's probably important that we don't, because if it had been proven that it was conclusively the Iroquois, it would likely have started another war, because part of the culture was, well, I have to avenge this loss and maybe bring back some more captives who will be adopted into our nation to replace the loved ones we have lost. And Chiwatenhwa would not have wanted that. And if it were members of his own nation, there might be either some division or retaliation, maybe on either side, who knows, but he wouldn't have wanted that either. I think one of the fascinating things is that the Jesuits had poured all this hope into Chiwatenhwa. And I think it's St. Charles Lalemant that says, after God, we had all our hope in this man. And Saint Marie of the Incarnation, who's a contemporary, called him the apostle with the apostles. That's how vital that he was. The beautiful thing is that after Joseph's death, what ends up happening is that actually spurs a wave of conversions. And his, I believe it is his brother, who becomes converted and then becomes a catechist and evangelizes very strongly. It produces a conversion in his brother and then a lot of other family members. And people who knew him said, wherever he has gone, I want to be there with him too. And so what keeps looking like disaster for the Jesuits in their story becomes one in which God tends to work miracles.
Now, we mentioned his brother being a catechist. So my understanding is that Joseph and his wife were
lay catechists. Is
Yes.
that right? Was he a parish administrator of some kind? Can you tell us about that?
He was actually the first. The Jesuits were setting up a new mission, and so basically Joseph and Marie opened up their own home to house the Eucharist and to have Mass there. And so they named him the first lay administrator of of what is today Canada. And it's really beautiful, because this is a person who, not only do you get this revelation that the Creator has become man, but you get this even more wonderful experience of that. Not only has he become man, but he still dwells with you. He lives among your houses. He lives in your village, in a house very much like your own. and he disguises himself under what looks like a piece of bread. There's something very beautiful and compelling to it, that the Creator's love is so great that he has found this way to live among you. And so again, that experience of the Eucharist is so deep in Joseph, and this is a feature that is throughout many different native experiences of the gospel, is this deep intimacy with Jesus, deep intimacy with Mary, this devotion to the Eucharist, and through Mass as much as possible, through adoration, and through daily prayer. What we consider a kind of a form of the Liturgy of the Hours, morning prayer, midday, evening prayer, and the Rosary. They're deeply connected to Jesus and Mary through the Rosary. That's the prayer that they carry with them. When they're hunting, when they're out in the fields. There's models of just beautiful divine intimacy and lay holiness. It's just incredible.
So obviously Joseph Chiwatenhwa was convinced that Christianity really affirmed what he loved most about his own cultural heritage, and yet the story of his death, because he wouldn't make a sacrifice of dogs to these spirits, obviously tells us that when it came down to it, he knew that there were certain things that he was going to have to leave behind about his culture's spirituality. You also mentioned vengeance as something very much part of the culture. So what I would wonder is, how did that the warrior aspect and the vengeance aspect of these northeastern native cultures, where we're talking about the Huron in particular here, how was that affected by the bringing of the gospel? I know that there were some Hurons who continued to be warriors. What would it have meant to be a Huron warrior who was also a Christian?
Here's where I would recommend that anybody who's seen the movie Black Robe get it out of their minds and possibly destroy that movie, because they weren't pacifists. The Huron Confederacy, and again, I would have to look deeper, but there's a lot of evidence that the Jesuits were not really interested in turning their flock into pacifists that were just going to get wiped out. The reality, the big reality of the times, and this is where, again, the point about pre-contact being a little bit unknown, is that there are certain mechanisms of... So this society right now is characterized by something called the Mourning Wars.
This is MOU. Mourning,
yes,
right?
MOUR, mourning, as in weeping. And ironically, the mechanism of having women have authority over whether the young men go to war or not is actually kind of a disincentive, supposed to be a disincentive to go to war, because women are generally those who suffer most from warfare, any kind, women and children. But the problem is that this mechanism gets completely thrown out of whack if the population is so vastly decreased that you need more men for the sake of your survival. You need more people for the sake of your survival. And part of it's also a culture that doesn't value dying in battle. A good heroic warrior should live to fight another day. You should stand your ground, prove your superior worth of your enemies, but dying is a bad idea.
Okay.
Yeah. Very, very different from some kind of European idea of I will bravely go and die in battle.
Right.
No, it distinguishes how warfare is done in the Americas. So yeah, the Huron, even the Huron Catholics, they don't remain pacifists. They don't become pacifists. At a certain point, the French have embarked on this idea that, well, we'll confirm evangelization by, if they convert, we will give them guns. And part of it was to encourage conversion. Another part was the French had this alliance, or were trying to make some kind of alliance with the Huron. And for the Huron to not lose power, they would need guns. Unfortunately, for the Huron, the French did not match what the Dutch were doing to supply the Huron adversaries, the Iroquois, 5 nations. So again, that's it's a deeper question for the anthropologist, but the big thing that ends up happening is war resume. A war to the finish breaks out between the Five Nations Iroquois Confederacy and the great Huron Confederacy, and I think the scale ultimately is tipped against the Huron for two big important reasons. One of which is that by this time, the Iroquois have amassed far more guns, and their confederacy is also bound more tightly together than I think the Huron Confederacy was. So they come through and they smash one village against another, and the Huron Confederacy, I think, tends to break, and people try to go back to defend their own nations and villages, and fortunately, that works against them. But the Jesuits did not come to bring the faith to ignorant of the realities of what life was like in that particular part of the world. So just happens that events transpired the way they did, despite the best of intentions.
Do we have any knowledge of sort of how the Huron warriors who were Christians would bring their faith to that?
Well, we do. It's kind of impressive, but this is especially seen when they're captured and hauled before their enemies. So they're being ritually tortured. So we have the example of there are these Huron warriors. One is called Eustace Ahasistari. But he's a companion with Isaac Jogue, and he's a fantastic, Huron warrior. He's feared by the Mohawk.
He was another one of those guys who was begging to be baptized for a long time before they finally did it, right?
He really was. Because we're like, I'm not so sure. And he says, yeah, I'm very sure. And I'm going on a dangerous mission, so baptize me. So he did. He makes a mistake in that he thought that a Mohawk party nearby was a lot smaller than it actually was. It's like 99 victories, and then just the one loss at the end is just the one that decides it. But anyway, he ends up being captured by them, and they want to haul him back alive because they want to make him pay for all the harm that he did their warriors. But this is a funny scene. So there's a funny scene. It's interesting. Not really hilarious, but he's being tortured, and I think it was at a Cernanon. But he's being tortured, and he is not saying a word, because part of how you witness, as part of the importance of their witness, because they're not just there as Hurons, but they're also there as Catholics, and the purpose of the torture is to make you scream and shout and beg for it to stop. But by resisting it and not saying a word, you show the greatness of your spirit, this sort of power. And this is very important because they've got to say nothing to show that this faith that they have has given them such great power that they can't, they will not break. They have the strength of the greatest of warriors, so to speak. And so Ahasistari, this probably would have been no problem for him anyway, but he's taking it. And Jogue, Isaac Jogue, that the Mohawks didn't quite know what to make of, is weeping. He's bawling his eyes out. He's making all these emotional prostrations. And the Mohawk are looking at this like, this guy acts worse than any of our women. This is not something that a man does. This is not something that a true brave warrior does. I mean, this guy is a coward. So, but the problem is again one of culture, because Jogue at this time, it was considered manly among the French to show great depths of emotion, to show how manly you were by showing how emotional you could be. So again, there's something that's being lost in translation, and this would happen with the missionaries another way, is they say, well, I'm trying to communicate that, and there would be misunderstandings. Even Brebeuf wasn't immune to them. But anyway, Jogue is doing this, and effectively, Ahasistari has to stop, has to basically speak out and explain to his audience that no, this is just his culture. He's not weeping for himself or being a coward. He is trying to express, his admiration for me. As essentially, Ahasistari has to spin it in a way for the people that are torturing him because, Jogues, you're embarrassing me. And then the whole thing, then they amps up the whole thing by taunting them and reminding them how many warriors he's taken down. Because now Ahasistari has to basically brag about how mighty and great and powerful a warrior he's been. But part of the ritual, because this is a ritual, is you have to call vengeance upon your enemies who are torturing you. And Ahasistari refuses. And his final prayer is that there may be peace one day between the Huron and the Iroquois. That's something that I don't think somebody in the Vatican in the 17th century would have really understood very well. What's going on and why this is an example of sanctity. And I don't think we would have understood it very well in the mid-20th century when the Jesuit priests and their companions got elevated to sainthood for martyrdom, and unfortunately, the native examples got left behind. But I do truly believe that we have many friends of these Jesuits in heaven that I really think they would like to see elevated on the altars of the church, and particularly since we're in an age now where the holiness of the lay vocation in every walk of life, with policeman, military, farmer, tradesman. I mean, essentially, when we talk of Huron warriors, we're talking about all of that in a particular person, because they were all those roles. That's very, very vital and important. And especially in America, we're thinking, wow, what examples do we have of holiness? There's really a treasure trove. And I mean, we're basically at 50 minutes and we haven't even scratched the surface. But these stories are amazing.
Has there been a cause for canonization open for Chiwatenhwa?
No, not yet. And I talked with somebody that said there was some movement starting around the time that John Paul II came to Canada. But the problem was that all of a sudden the stories about the residential schools, which is a very, very painful period of Canadian U.S. history in which, unfortunately, the church did participate. A lot of the insights and the vision of the original missionary effort was lost by the 19th century. And there are a lot of historical and cultural factors that go into it. But basically, long story short, a lot of missionaries lost the spirit of Brebeuf and his fellow Jesuit companions, and instead adopted what they thought was a compromise or the best that they could do. But probably wasn't good in the long term of, trying to be basically participants in Canadian U.S. government programs of quote unquote civilizing the Indian.
Right. Yeah. There's a quote from one residential school teacher who said he wanted to kill the Indian and save the man and things like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely horrible things, and that's why St. John Paul II's words are so important. And he says, "Christ in his body is himself Indian." To kill the Indian in a man is to essentially kill Christ and crucify him, because Christ gave all these beautiful cultures and gave people their cultures so that they could come to know him through them. They just have very unique insights that also help strengthen us, an appreciation for, a closeness to the Creator. I mean, the examples of these stories, again, very, some people feel more close to Mary than they do to Jesus. Some people don't understand where Mary is. The native people understand both. They feel very, very close to them. The beauty of the Liturgy of the Hours, Vatican II tries to get that going on, but you don't see parish vespers very often. But it was something that was familiar in the lives of the first evangelized native people. And it's something we can still do. The more that we learn about these people and what made them holy can help make our own communities and parishes and, men and women holy. You don't become a martyr. You don't give your life for Christ if you don't believe it, or if it's cheap, or if it's, some
right.
sort of, worldly reason, like, well, I just wanted some more trade goods and some guns. Nobody becomes a martyr for that.
Right. One of the most fascinating things to me about the the Indian cultures in Canada and upstate New York and thereabouts is this practice of adoption of people from other tribes to replace effectively people who had been killed or died. And they really would adopt you and almost treat you as if you were the person that you were replacing. So how did that actually end up helping to spread the gospel?
Well, this is actually one of the real untold stories, and because a lot of people don't know how successful the faith was in being transmitted to the arch enemy of the Huron, the Iroquois. And the Jesuits knew that somehow there must be a connection between John de Brebeuf, Isaac Jogues, and Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. And essentially, the connection is that after the Great Cataclysmic War in 1649, when the Five Nations come through and they just smash the Huron, and they're nearly wiped out. The Huron had to reconstitute their nation as a diaspora. They basically said, we've got to leave our homeland and go elsewhere. And they're still around. The Wyandot nations are still here with us, and so they're the people that have given this treasury of holiness in North America. But what happened is that there were approximately 1,000 Huron who were captured for the purposes of being adopted. So not only were many people killed, but thousands were basically taken back to the Five Nations and distributed to be adopted into their nations. Because again, it's not just the Huron losing a lot of people due to disease and occasionally to war, but it's the Iroquois as well. And so they do that. But the beautiful thing is that the Huron who are Catholic retain the Catholic faith and retain the lessons. And the reason they're able to do that is because in their oral culture, the way that their languages are is I was explained to this by a Mohawk language teacher, is that they're verbal. So an entire, what might be a word in Mohawk, is actually a sentence. So for example, who is a Christian? Well, the name for Christian is a true person who makes the sign of the cross. So the language becomes the key for not only preserving your identity and your traditions and your stories and your customs, but also for transmitting the faith. And what you have here is then these convicted Huron Catholics who now have become part of the Mohawk Nation, Cayuga Nation, Oneida Nation, Onondaga Nation, the Seneca Nation, and they retain their faith. They are sharing their faith. They're spreading it. Chiwatenhwa's daughter, her name is Therese. She was captured with Jogues and essentially adopted into another nation. I think it was the Onondaga. Eventually, the Mohawks sold her, gave her to an Onondaga man's family, and I don't think that relationship worked out. But anyway, so she was considered part of them now. But she continued to spread the faith, and there were, when the Jesuits finally met up with her again after peace was reestablished, she informed them that she had educated another person in the faith, and she's been captured for a long time. So it's the language that becomes the vessel for transmitting the faith. And again, it's also another reason why, when it comes to Native people, it is in the Church's own best interest to make sure that they do not lose the language, because not only it helps them retain their identity, but it also is that vessel through which the faith has been held on and communicated. And it's enormously important. So that's why I do consider re-immersing Native people in languages and helping them re-immerse themselves in languages that they have lost because they were taken away from them is actually a work of spreading the gospel. because that's what they used to spread the gospel back in the 17th, 18th, even 19th centuries, and today it still has an important role.
So we've been talking a lot about the Northeast. Can you tell us about the Martyrs of La Florida in the Southeast?
Yes, I would love to, and I'm really hoping that I can learn a lot more about them. And but I had the privilege of writing this story for the National Catholic Register, and one of the things I came across was that there were these hundreds of martyrs that took place in what was called Spanish La Florida. It was actually part of the Spanish Empire that wasn't considered too very valuable, but from the Spanish point of view, but they did want to have trading posts and some nominal, control for their empire and for trade and things like that. But there was also a fair level of autonomy as well. And what you have with the Martyrs of La Florida is, I think it's approximately 30 different martyrdom events, but there's some really, really big ones. And they are kicked off because the English, the Anglo-American settlers living in the Carolinas, are looking for two things. First of all, they hate the Spanish, and they hate Catholicism, which is the animating feature of the time. Is unfortunately there was intense religious hatred. In Europe, it was Catholics against Protestants, Protestants against Catholics. And that's they brought those rivalries over here. And the Anglo-American settlers in the Carolinas in the very early 18th century, so about 1704, launch recruit native allies, the Creek. I think they were big, and they decided that they were going to wipe out Catholicism in wherever it existed in modern day Georgia and Spain and Florida, once and for all. And while they were at it, they were going to enslave the native peoples who resisted them. The big nations that were in their way and sort of protecting all the other smaller nations on the Florida Peninsula were the Appalachee and the Timucua nations, if I can remember that correctly. But the Appalachee were the huge ones. They basically had become largely Catholic. They had a substantial Catholic population. And it's this native nation that is for whom the Appalachian Trail is named after, same group. And the English came down with their native allies and beat the Appalachee in battle, and the Spanish had sent a force as well. But the English had supplied their allies with guns, and they gave them a technological advantage that they otherwise would never have had. And the Spanish, much like the French, had failed to give their own native allies similar technological resources. I mean, certainly one of the various factors behind it was, you don't want to necessarily upset the balance of, upset things that are going on. But the reality is that it already had happened. And the English were supplying all these guns and ammunition, so the Appalachee basically had no chance against muskets and cannons. Although they fought very, very bravely. Again, not exactly pacifists. When the English came through, they came to each of these missions and conquered them. They gave the Appalachee the Appalachee basically a choice, which is convert, renounce your Catholic faith, and become slaves, or die. This may have a familiar ring to some of our listeners with what has happened to our Middle Eastern Christian brethren. Not anything necessarily religious. It's just a comment on how dark human nature can get even when people profess a certain faith. So the cause of the La Florida mission martyrs is underway. It's a beautiful cause, and their website has a lot of short biographies of a lot of the people that we know of, and there's approximately 100 Native American men and women that we know of, number of priests and other even European laymen, Spanish typically, who also gave their lives. And the beautiful example that you have here is really a church that is one. This was a church where the language the friars were speaking, the largely Franciscan friars, and the soldiers were speaking was typically not Spanish, but it was actually Appalachian. For a long time in the Empire of Spain, until relatively about this time, there had been a preference for allowing the dominant local language to be the administrative language. So when they all face martyrdom, you have stories of priests who go to minister to their people, even though they know that they're not going to be coming back. And the same thing with these heroic laymen, laywomen Catholics. I mean, the lead martyr is Antonio Quipa, and he's a craftsman. He is a musician. He spreads the gospel through these beautiful painted flutes. He would paint like scenes, stories from the Bible on them. And he would, in Appalachia, his language, he would tell, play music, and then you tell the story of the Creator's love for you. And again, similar features. A very Eucharistic-centered person, very devoted to Jesus' mother, to the Mother of God, Mary. The Rosary. When they learned their catechism, they would make their own rosaries. And they didn't make their rosaries just adding a bunch of beads, but every lesson of the catechism, of the faith, that they learned was another bead. And by the time that they had finished their rosary, they knew the faith. Wouldn't that be cool if we did that today in our, CCD class and things like that? That's what they did. And hopefully we'll have access to it, but there's a beautiful last will and testament that Antonio Quipa gives, because he's going to the Ayubala mission, where he knows he's going to die, but it's an attempt to see if he can lift the siege and allow, the people trapped inside to escape and to leave. And he knows success is probably not going to be likely, but he says, what else can I do? So there's tons of documentation that the Franciscans preserved, and hopefully the cause will be verified by the Vatican. And then we'll have all this resources and material that can help tell the story in a much fuller way. But he goes, his priest goes with him, and some other companions. They're captured. And then the English set up, the English have them ritually tortured, attached to the crosses in the Ayubala mission. And again, give them this ultimatum, convert or die, and they won't. So they're ritually tortured and then burned to death right there in the mission. I think we helped build it. But, he testifies to the faith, he forgives his enemies, and he has a vision of the Blessed Virgin comforting him. And he tells the rest of them to hold fast to the faith because Our Lady is with them. This is a guy who, if he were today, he would be a construction worker, a leader of his town council, who's called an Anesia. So basically second to the chief of their village. But this guy was a Catholic, and he believed this message of Jesus Christ with every ounce of his being, and he wanted and it was the most important thing to him. And it was the one thing that he wouldn't trade. He valued that above all else, because with Jesus Christ is life and joy. And these martyrs knew that they may lose their lives, but the Creator, Jesus, the Son of the Father, will give it all back for their faithfulness. And you see,
that's amazing.
Yeah, and you see all these different stories, these heroic women testifying to their faith. One of them, I forget what her name is, but they're telling her, look at, you just come with us, and you'll live. And I mean, it was basically an invitation to slavery, but she wasn't stupid. But she makes a deeper point, which is, but if we go with you, we will not have the faith. We will not have the priest. We will not have the Eucharist. You're offering us a base. What it came down to is, with the faith is life, and what you offer is slavery and death, and we choose life. And so they were all martyred. There's one town where 200 people were forced to dig their own grave and martyred. It's all these enormous stories that were so powerful.
And what century was this?
This is the 18th century, and a lot of these. There was a big one in 1704, and then 1706, and it continues.
So the colonies already exist, but the Spanish are still there, sort of.
Yeah, so it's a different arrangement than what was in Mexico, where there's actual heavy Spanish colonization, but in La Florida it tends to be the population is largely native people, and with a much smaller European presence. And essentially what ends up happening is all these after the Appalachian and the Timucua are destroyed, nearly completely wiped out, Florida becomes steadily depopulated with all the increasing rating. It's just absolutely terrible. But there's heroic witnesses of Catholic faith and conviction that I think would inspire people today.
In your article on this, which I'll link people to in the show notes, you give the number of about 1,000 or over 1,000 martyrs. And does that include the whole of North America, or is that just in the Southeast there?
That is what we think are in the Southeast. Now,
wow,
that doesn't mean but we don't know all their identities. So we do know that. So as I was told, we know that 200 people in one village, just one, refused to renounce the faith, and they were told to dig their own grave, and they were killed brutally. But we know the identities of approximately more than 100 of them, I believe.
Okay,
if I recall correctly, and that's largely the vast majority are native people, with also the priests and some soldiers who actually gave their lives for Christ. There's this one soldier who was he was being tortured, but he was preaching in the Appalachian tongue to hold fast to the faith. And they found his body later, but the witness had actually impressed the Creek, I think it was the Creek Nation warriors who had tortured him, that they left a crown on his head, a crown of flowers. In other words, it was a sign of respect. And one of the things that you do have is one of these martyrs, 20 years down the road, another martyrdom event, was actually part of the former persecutors.
Wow.
Of these other Indian people. And I think there was some suspicion about him at first, but he really proved it, and he really offered his life for this newfound faith.
Yeah, well, that's the Christian story in a nutshell there.
We got a beautiful story, Tom. I mean, that's the thing. I don't think I'm the best spokesperson for it, and I'm still trying to improve my knowledge of various, Native nation customs and the history and things like that. So if any of your listeners say, well, I think you got that wrong, I apologize. I'm still a learner. But I have enormous amount of respect for these people that I've been able to encounter. And I've been learning more about how they understood the faith and why it was important to them. And I'm learning, I feel like we've got this beautiful gift that they gave us, their own lives and their own testimony, that we really have an opportunity to honor and discover today. And I wish we had more of these people, on our calendar. And maybe there's now an opportunity for us to do that. I mean, if the La Florida Mission Martyrs cause goes through, most of the saints of North America will be martyrs. And they will be laymen, and they will be laywomen, and also they will be majority native. And that's not to say that one people against another, but maybe to recall that, but in Christ, we're all one in his body. And this will now help us define and understand our roots, our spiritual roots, as an American church, rooted in native people, grown up and expanded through a European immigrant church, but maybe now flowering, because if we can recall, if we can bring these two together, the evangelized this resource of the Native American taproot of our American church flowing powerfully again through that, European grafting on, and perhaps producing a new flowering in our own, third millennium. I think there's a lot of possibility, and that's why I hope that we all start to learn more about these stories and to internalize them. But I just hope that the people of God ask their bishops, please, let's learn these stories. Let's spread these stories. And for so many Native people who their cultures are enormously struggling, they're a lot of the terrible things that they struggle with today are diametrically opposed to the cultural values and traditions that the Jesuits loved so much, that the missionaries praised so highly.
Right.
And so they've got to stop being marginal people on our consciousness. They're truly at the margins of our church. And I really think that by knowing these stories and by thanking them and then saying, you know what, we've got to do something to work with them to change the spiritual equation, to restore their culture so that we may learn and be also restored as one American Catholic family on this North American continent.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. There's a lot more we could have touched on. We didn't talk about St. Junipero Serra, but that's not because I don't think he's worth talking about, but it's just that most of the work you've been doing so far has been on the Northeast and the Southeast.
Yes, and I'll hopefully have more opportunity to in my work to eventually get there and to expand on him. We're learning a lot more through those archives are largely in Spanish, and so there's a task that needs to be done to get them into English and transmit the story. But I've hopefully you'll be able to link to a lot of my different articles. There's a beautiful story of stories of Lakota Catholicism with Nicholas Black Elk.
Right. Yeah, I was hoping to talk about him, but I think we'll just have to be satisfied with linking to that article.
Link to my articles. I think they're a great place for people to. They're a great place for people to start. At the end of the day, the reality is that we have an opportunity to discover people who are really, truly saints and martyrs, and they lived very much like you and me.
Yeah. Aside from having more Native American saints, we could use some more male American saints too. So I'm sure we'll get some of those if the La Florida martyrs are canonized.
Yes. And I hope somebody starts to make a push for Joseph Chiwatenhwa, because he really is a hero of mine, and he's really inspired me to live my faith more intentionally and deeply. And I think he and his wife together would be like the power evangelization couple for North America, and they're not the only ones.
I'm optimistic of seeing some canonizations within our lifetime.
Me too. Yeah, I think we're able to appreciate the stories as they need to be now. I don't know if we could have done it 50 years ago or 100, but I think definitely now. I think now is the time that.
Right, especially because at this time people are looking for, a lot of Catholics are looking for a new paradigm, or if not seeking to switch entirely. There's a lot of questions about the liberal tradition and things that are being discussed by American Catholic thinkers now. All that's good, but we should also look further into our history. And it could be a different model on which to inculturate, rather than throwing out the American constitutional tradition altogether.
Well, I think actually that's the big point. I think that's actually the big point, which is that we've got to understand that our culture has a lot of problems, and it has had a very uneven history. But that's what with a lot of different cultures. The thing that we've got to be looking at is, well, what makes me truly American? I mean, the faith is shining through me. It's the faith living in me that will purify what is truly good about being an American, and the things that are bad about being an American, so to speak, the other cultural appreciations, they fall away because they're not what God has made us to be as Americans and as our Catholic faith expressing ourselves through our various American cultures. And I think that's important for us to remember. And it's a lot of people are thinking, well, do we have to throw out the whole thing? No, not at all. No. Think about how does the faith work through our culture and our cultural institutions and become alive. And I know a lot of people are thinking about the Benedict option, but the reality is that we actually have really beautiful models that were here, lived here. Caughnawaga is where St. Kateri finished her life is truly a village of saints. I mean, that's what it was. And again, readers can, your listeners can start to get a sense of that through some of the articles that I've written about Caughnawaga and its founders, and some of the people that were contemporaries of St. Kateri became holy like her, and several who became martyrs.
Yeah, and providentially, these are just the sort of models and paradigms that were proposed by Vatican II and by St. John Paul II. And
precisely,
we've got it right there. It's amazing to see these things happening several hundred years ago. But I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for coming on, Peter, and sharing all this with us. I really enjoyed it, and I found reading your articles on this topic very edifying. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Tom. God bless.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Peter. Really cool topic. The one thing we sort of lost track of there, unfortunately, in the interview was the sort of step-by-step process by which the practice of ritual adoption led to the creation of this Catholic community in which St. Kateri was formed. But you can read about that in a couple of Peter's articles, which, again, I'll link to at catholicculture.org/episode 3. All right, it's time for today's excerpt. This one is from Victor Frankenstein. I'm going to say it again. This one is from Victor Frankenstein. A human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never to allow passion or a transitory desire to disturb his tranquility. I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful. That is to say, not befitting the human mind. If this rule were always observed, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with the tranquility of his domestic affections, Greece had not been enslaved, Caesar would have spared his country, America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed. All right, that's it for this episode. Thanks a lot for listening, as always. One quick announcement, we are taking donations on Patreon. www.patreon.com. Oh yeah, in case you don't know what Patreon is, it's Patreon. So that's patreon.com/Catholic Culture Podcast. You can support the podcast for as little as $1 per month. And if you do that, there are some bonuses. First of all, I'll pray for your soul. Secondly, if you support the podcast on Patreon, you will get the full original tracks of the music I composed and recorded specifically for use on this podcast. It's just over 20 minutes of music. I finally got it mastered, so I should be ready to send that out to people who donate within the next week or so. And you will get high-quality audio files, not MP3s, because MP3s are for secularists. For those who are familiar with the donation system we already have on CatholicCulture.org, if you're wondering why we're doing a separate Patreon thing for the podcast, it's basically just a way of tracking people's enthusiasm for this particular project as distinct from all the other stuff we do at Catholic Culture. Also, I'm hoping to draw a slightly wider audience for the podcast that would normally come to Catholic Culture. So it's just one way of gauging people's enthusiasm, and of course that money goes back into producing the podcast. Okay, that's it for this week, and next week it will be Dr. Carrie Gress on her book, The Marian Option. See ya.